Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today in the program, for the first segment, we are delighted to welcome back to the program after quite a while, the one and only Will Potter. Will Potter, you might know from the great landmark book, Green is the New Red. We had Will on a while back, a long time ago when that book came out. Will Potter has continued to do amazing work, and he has a new book out also on City Lights called Little Red Barns: Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable. Will Potter, for those of you that may not know but should, is an award-winning investigative journalist and TED Senior Fellow who exposes political repression and the erosion of civil liberties. Will, I'm afraid your analytical lens is needed maybe now more than ever. Your reporting and commentary has appeared in the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Rolling Stone, and has helped overturn prosecutions and challenge censorship laws. And we have certainly approve of that fine work, Will Potter. You've also been invited to testify before U.S. Congress, the Australian Parliament, Council of Europe, advocating for protest rights and press freedom. Your new book, Little Red Barns, is the result of a 10-year investigation into factory farms and rising fascism. Was recently named one of Publishers Weekly's most anticipated releases and starred reviews of the year. Your journalism and scholarship, Will Potter, has been heavily influenced by growing up in the hardcore punk scene, and you've collaborated with bands including Rise Against. You're previously a Knight Wallace Fellow and visiting professor at the University of Michigan, and were named the Distinguished Journalist in Residence at the University of Denver Stern College of Law. Born and raised in Texas, Fort Worth, Texas, Will Potter, welcome back to the Project Censored Show.
It's great to be back, Mickey. Thanks for having me.
Will, thanks so much for all of your work just over the last 2 decades. You can learn more at willpotter.com, those of you out there listening or watching. Will, let's start literally from your beginning. How did you get into this world of radical muckraking independent journalism? And there's obviously some overlaps with indie music and alternative culture. Will Potter.
Yeah, I really found both of them around the same time. I was about 13 and got exposed to punk rock and journalism really in the same era. Reminded of that old Joe Strummer quote of the essence of punk rock is give us some truth, right? And I think that's what kind of drew me to both of them. As a weirdo kid growing up outside of Fort Worth, Texas, and it's not really the hotbed of the counterculture and journalism and the music scene gave me a license to ask questions. And also me, to expose myself to a lot of ideas and concepts that I just didn't have. So, and it was transformative for me. And especially with this book, with Little Red Barns, that was critical to me finding out about all these issues, about these new forms of activism, about factory farms, about political repression. And it was all through my connections in that punk and art scene to start.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, going back to the early 80s, the music of the Dead Kennedys, Jello Biafra. Later, of course, when I got to meet Jello, I found out that a lot of the ideas for song lyrics he got were from articles in the San Francisco Bay Guardian, which republished Carl Jensen's Project Censored Top 10 Stories. Funny story, long way around to that.
And I love
it. That I came to working at Project Censored. So small world, but so many of the people that we run into in the independent media world have this connection to alternative music, independent music, and culture. And I really appreciate and resonate with what you said about how much you learned from that and how it gave you the opportunity not just to see different ideas and hear different perspectives, but also, have the curiosity and courage to ask questions and to go against the grain. Will.
And it's really just a different way of viewing the world and how we move through it. Right? All of a sudden, especially through like underground music and alternative music scenes, it's not just about consuming what you're fed, but you actually get to make things. And if for me in the hardcore scene, it was really transformative. The DIY ethic, this idea that if you want to start a band, just go start a band. If you want to tour the world, you can go tour the world. You can create a pirate radio station. You can do whatever the heck you want. And that is just such a powerful and kind of a dangerous thing. And to start reminding people how much agency they have. And you would think that spirit, flash forward years later when I started Green is the New Red as a news service, before it was a book, it was really that my spirit. I was just traveling the world speaking about FBI abuses, staying on people's couches the way you would with the touring band. I mean, I really approached it the same way. I think it started very well.
Yeah, there's absolutely overlap. And, Project Censored is a pretty punk rock org in and of itself. It was founded on a campus, of course, in Northern California, but moved off campus and for the better part of a decade lived in my garage.
Indeed.
And we toured around and did our things the same kind of way. Again, the overlap is extraordinary. So, and again, I was reminded of some of the background by looking at your website, willpotter.com, and then looking through your latest book from City Lights, Little Red Barns. You kind of got tipped off or sparked in ways. You had some early run-ins very, very early in your life and career that overlap with the FBI. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, pretty much straight out of college, I was a cub reporter at the Chicago Tribune. I got visited by the FBI because I went out with a protest campaign, an animal rights campaign against an animal testing company. And at the time, the FBI was labeling these activists and environmentalists as the #1 domestic terrorism threat. And that really became not just my first book reason, but it completely changed my life. I'd already been aware of things like, but when it comes close to home, it became an obsession of trying to understand how this happened, trying to help other people who were experiencing those kind of tactics as well.
Yeah, absolutely. If you go back far enough in our history, Will Potter, back to 2006, you were part of a nomination for one of the top underreported or censored stories that was about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, and that goes back quite a ways with us. Can you remind our listeners a little bit about that? Because that's nearly 20 years ago, and a lot of the repression we see right now, I feel for people, for particularly Gen X folks, that's the post 9/11 environment. That's when so many of the draconian laws and executive orders and things were going on in the several years after that, from the USA Patriot Act, the foundation of the Department of Homeland Security, all these other Orwellian state machinations of repression. Remind our listeners about that history, the AETA, and how, that's, to me, in a lot of ways, and you write about that, of course, in Little Red Barns, but that's all part of the lineage of this narrative that you're talking.
It is. I mean, it's a long trajectory. And for your listeners who might not be, animal rights people, I might think of this as like a fringe issue or isolated. It's really important to remember that, the day of the 9/11 attacks, you had members of Congress openly speculating that it was the work of animal rights and environmental activists. So as soon as that happened, they were already chomping at the bit for new so-called eco-terrorism laws and powers to protect corporate interests. And I argue in Little Red Barn, really become convinced this is the modern playbook. There's no other social movement that was hit in the same way with this corporate and state power in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 than these groups. And it led to things like the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. That's so broad, it even labels nonviolent civil disobedience as terrorism.
It's ludicrous.
It's ludicrous. And then flash forward, when I testified, I said, we have to stop this law because it can be used against journalists and nonviolent undercover investigators. And members of Congress said, no, you're nuts. That's never going to happen. You're scaremongering. A few years later, that's what created this book, Little Red Barns, as states were starting to do exactly that. They were labeling investigators with cameras as terrorists for exposing what happens on these factory farms.
Yeah, and in other words, literally, shooting, attacking, arresting the messengers, like literally going after and literally. That if you silence the journalist, if you silence the whistleblowers, there's no crimes being committed, there's no atrocities taking place. Not only are these not the droids you're looking for, there are no droids.
No droids. Don't mind us and what we're being exposed doing. What happens to 10 billion animals a year in the United States on factory farms? What happens to workers and child workers and people that are being human trafficked and abused and environmental pollution? Pay no attention to that. And let's talk about the people with the press.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And it's an extraordinary story. You dedicate the book to Upton. Yeah, of course, it's Upton Sinclair.
Sinclair, personal hero.
Not absolutely, man. And not just for the jungle, but the brass check 1919, a scathing critique of the profession of journalism,
Absolutely. He stood up to
corporate
others in the
journalism.
crafts, corporate journalism. He stood up to the oil and gas industry. He stood up to the oligarchs. I mean, he really cut his own path. And as a result of that, I found him out in my archival research. He really struggled with uh, his role as a journalist and kind of a public intellectual of what it means to bear witness to all this stuff and how do we actually expose it. Uh, he thought he was doing that jungle, and he inadvertently kind of caused a regulatory mechanism that only favored the industry itself. And he really struggled with that later in his life.
Wow. Teddy Roosevelt's personal physician, I believe, is the one that caught wind of Sinclair's work.
That's right.
And brought it to his attention. And then that sparked the first federal regulatory measures protecting the public from ill practices of that entire industry, meatpacking in particular, but of course others related. And that goes back to 1906. That goes back quite a ways.
Yeah, and at the time, Roosevelt and others hated Sinclair. Right? He was
a
socialist, but he was a socialist, and they were going after him. The term breaker was to demean people like him, like they're just stirring them up. They're no good. They're troublemakers. And so even from those early days, exposing the truth had consequences. And it was only through really his persistence in getting public attention that he was able to break through that.
It's great. You have a chapter called Upton's iPhone, and you have a quote. It was like some horrible crime committed in a dungeon, all unseen and unheard, buried out of sight and of memory, which you just paraphrased moments ago about the work that you've been doing and others to expose the corruption and absolutely inhumane treatment and behavior, as well as environmental degradation of this massive multi-billion-dollar industry.
Well, we have to remember that now through these new technologies, all of us have that incredible power in our pockets, right? It's not just for doom scrolling, but we can document police abuse, factory farm abuse, ice raids that we see on the street. And those are dangerous tools to people in power. And so part of the discussion in Little Red Barns is we have to remember that this news isn't just being made by credentialed journalists. These press freedoms need to apply to everybody because everyday citizens can be using these tools to make
absolutely. And another reason that we really promote media literacy education, critical thinking, is that individuals possess the capacity to do exactly this kind of work. And now we have tools that are problematic for all additional reasons than you already mentioned: surveillance, addiction, all kinds of things. But the tools also enable us. You wrote in here, and this was really compelling. You wrote, Sinclair, when writing The Jungle, did all this with a pen. No pinhole cameras, no drones. He didn't have direct access to the public either. He had to record his interviews and notes with a notepad. Then his accounts had to be published, printed, bound, passed by hand from one reader to the next. He had to bear witness and make the world see with only the written word. And, I mentioned the brass check before, which he made available for free to the public, had over 150,000 copies of that, man. I mean, that's, again, the ultimate DIY. But Upton Sinclair was a punk rocker.
He was a punk rocker. I mean, he did it with that defiant spirit. Even with the meat magnates and the owners of these corporations, I mean, he really just was in utter defiance of them. So you want to try to shut me down and find new ways of exposing this. And I think we have to remember that because there's just such radical potential there. We kind of take for granted these tools we have now, but the power of story to transform public opinion and to really shift the entire culture is something that we can't lose sight of.
Well, Will, you talk about that in the book, of course. This is certainly a decade worth of investigative work and reporting and meticulous research, and it's also another form of memoir, right? And I mean, again, it's very compelling. I have to say, you have a particular knack and gift for merging those types of things, these important factual issues, these significant societal affairs, but also meld it with why it's important, not just to you personally, but why it should matter to all of us as humans collectively in with our lived experiences in this society, particularly a society like ours that rests on so many values and principles that we need investigative muckraking journalists to help us live up to those, not settle to the bottom and ever aspire to these empty platitudes.
I appreciate that very much. And, and I'm open about how I struggled with it. And the book, as a journalist, have put this faith in that act of bearing witness. That if I document the truth and I expose it, photograph it, and cite it, that's going to be enough to shift public opinion. And it's really it scares me right now that we're seeing those basic concepts eroded of from everything from press freedom to the nature of truth and fact itself, and to use these tools to change culture. And I think we need to really bring them back for us.
Yeah, you and I have long been talking about the scourge of, quote, fake news is nothing new. It's propaganda repackaged and weaponized for political purposes. But this has been a problem, going back since people started telling stories. Sure. Right. The idea that people just discovered fake news a decade ago is just patently absurd, which we've said in almost every book we've done since, and tried to go back. And I'm an historian by day. And so for me, it's the history of those people that tell these stories, including you. It's because of this kind of work that people have the opportunity to really see what's happening around them and decide, right? This is kind of the ultimate sort of democratic modality, really, small d, right? Meaning it's that power of information and the right to public knowledge that you were just saying is under attack and being eroded. That's what we need to protect. And I think one of the ways that we protect it best is by showcasing the important work that you and other investigative journalists are doing. You may not see this on CNN. You may not see it on Fox. And it may not even get fair coverage in the New York Times, though you've managed to crack into some of the corporate media world and some of the upper echelons of the journalistic profession, which is, you deserve even more accolades, in my opinion, for being able to achieve that in the face of the institutional adversity where there's great pressure in establishment journalism not to tell those stories because they offend very powerful people. And so just that in and of itself, Will, is again further testament to, your will, no pun intended, your nature, right? As this is what's at the core of being an investigative reporter, is that you're not just bearing the witness, you're sharing the story. And then you have to be able to tell the story in a compelling way that relates to people across humanity, which again, I think you do very well. But that's what's often lacking in so much journalism from the corporate media. There's not any connectivity with the communities that they allegedly serve.
100%. And I feel like that's part and parcel of why journalists are being marginalized and seen in some ways relevant and replaced by content creators, other kind of hacks that aren't doing with journalism.
Yeah.
Is that we're so far down this corporate model that we've lost connection with our readers, connection with passion and the truth and the powerful ways that we can engage the public with our defiance and with moral clarity. I think those aren't dirty words. And as a journalist, they're doing work like this. You don't know if it's going to break through. You don't know if people are going to read the book. But in some ways, we keep doing it as journalists because we have to think about the people coming after us.
Absolutely.
That's part why, it's bearing witness for history in some ways, that we have to create these chronologies and these records of what it was like in these moments, because we have to have the faith that other people are coming looking for answers. Just like I went up to Sinclair's archives looking for answers from 100 years ago. And that's really what animated me this book. Of saying, you know what, man, I don't know how this is going to shake out with this book, these social crises right now, but I have the faith that other people are going to come looking for these answers.
Absolutely, Will Potter. And you are shaking all the right foundations of the institutions that need to be shook up and need to be held to account. We're speaking with Will Potter. We're talking about his new book, Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with Eleanor Goldfield. Later on in the program, you're going to hear guest host Misha Hercules. She'll be talking with Heidi Bogosian about her latest book on civil liberties and cyberspace. And of course, Will Potter, you're no stranger to Heidi. Heidi Bogosian actually had some very great things to say about your new book, saying Will Potter is in a league of his own, an exacting and compassionate investigative journalist. His firsthand explorations of entrenched power's underbelly show us some of humanity's worst inclinations. And again, that's about your new book out from City Lights, Little Red Barns. You can learn more at willpotter.com. Will, we've been talking about history and, sort of how you got into this book, the importance of telling stories. Of course, in my independent journalism courses, I always look to history, and I spend a certain part of the course looking back over the 20th century at, the Ida Tarbells, the Upton Sinclairs, the George Seldies, the I.F. Stones. And I ask the students, who's that now, right? Part of some of their assignments is, who's doing this work right now, right under our noses? And it's interesting because a lot of my students are journalism majors, but they don't always understand or know or have been subject to independent journalism, right? And so there's sometimes questions about it. And I don't use the term mainstream media because to me, it's a propagandistic misnomer that allows cover and shield for the fourth estate that isn't earned. They don't speak for the masses. They speak for their shareholders. They don't necessarily illuminate things we need to know. They illuminate what they want us to be discussing or divided by or distracted by. That's not to suggest that they never do any quality reporting. I'm not an absolutist in that capacity. But Will, tell us some things, that you know that are really important parts of your new book, Little Red Barns, that are maybe too radioactive for corporate media, that they won't go to and that they wouldn't talk about.
Yeah, I encountered directly in the course of writing this book. For instance, when a young woman named Amy Meyer was being prosecuted because she filmed a cow being pushed by heavy equipment outside of the slaughterhouse, a cow that was too sick to walk. She was one of the first people, the first person prosecuted under one of these ag-gag laws, state censorship laws. And I worked all of my contacts with everybody from, national media outlets, local, and I had worst time trying to get any traction, despite my credentials and relationships, to cover this story. And I've wrestled with that quite a bit. And I think it reflects a few things. It's the heavy influence of the industry. I think it's a marginalization of these issues. I think it's a distrust, in some ways, independent journalists who are existing and pushing back against some of those structures, like a lot of us do. And what was really striking to me, when I published that story myself, I just put it up on my website, kind of I.F. Stone style.
Yeah.
It on your own, right?
Will's Weekly.
Reward.
Yeah.
That the prosecutor dropped the charges within 48 hours. And so I think there's something to be said about, we need, in some ways, these larger media structures, right? They have value in some ways, but we also need independent journalists and people who are more willing to bump up against those structures and speak truth to power, not just to corporations, government, but to our colleagues. And to say, no, this is a press freedom story. This is a civil liberties story. And ultimately, on a positive note, that was successful. I mean, in these lawsuits, I was a plaintiff challenging that guy, and we got all the big press freedom groups. We got the news associations on board, but it took a fight.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it isn't just trying to influence the larger platforms in corporate media to get messages to more and more people. We know that that's a daunting challenge, but interestingly, it seems to be equally challenging, as you were alluding, to talk to other reporters, to get them to see the significance of the nature of a story that just won't get picked up, or the New York Times, one of the favorite tactics is we covered that. Yeah, they mentioned it one time in the B section about some quasi-related thing, and it's archived, and if you looked it up on a search engine, it would come up. and they covered it, right?
Right.
But oftentimes they're not going into detail. They're certainly not talking to some of the people you're talking to about these kinds of issues. And you've even had people from, you'd think this would be a no-brainer for the media to cover these kinds of things. You've even been, attacked. You've had people threaten you. You've had people from the industry, talk openly about how people should shoot down drones or harass you. I mean, talk a little bit about that unglamorous side of the profession.
I have a lot to say about unglamorous.
Yeah, I mean,
Real.
this is the glamorous part.
The glamorous part is, I have the glossy book out there, the Washington Post review, and those things.
I saw that. Kudos these.
It was a slog, and it comes with a lot of personal risk consequences that in this media environment really exacerbated. The consequence of being independent is you have a bit more freedom and flexibility and punches in different ways, but you don't have that institutional support. So when you have these massive industries talking and making threats like that, or you have these right-wing groups that come after you, you don't have a team of lawyers. You don't have institutional support to get you through that. And I will say, even as I'm saying, we're looking at the big players with institutional support are still caving to the current Trump administration.
Yes.
So it's an increasingly dangerous landscape. I'll tell you what, I was in Turkey in 2015 with a group of journalists, and it was striking to see what journalists there were dealing with. I mean, we met with CNN Turkey that morning. Their bottom floor of their offices were bombed out. The windows were out. And you come home and you feel like a foreign correspondent at home. These attacks on journalism, I was raised thinking, these are things that happen in other countries, that are happening in wars, that happen in authoritarian regimes. They're coming closer and closer to home, but now they're right here in front of us. And it's shifting the nature of the craft. It's making it a lot more risky, but at the same time, a lot more.
Yeah, that absolutely on that front. Well, Potter, we have a few minutes left here, and I wanted to give you two opportunities. One, is there a particular story or a particular part of the book that really stands out to you that you would like to share with people? Maybe even something that's a little different than some of the subjects we've been getting at. Another part of the story, another part of the narrative in the telling.
The first thing that came to mind was I actually had some drone problems when I was doing investigations. I lost a drone in rural Washington. And through that, I was connected with a longtime resident named Ellen Redout. And Helen took me on a tour of her community. And it's all as the title of the book indicates, little red barns dotting the countryside is what we like to think of farm towns. And she showed me what's happened after these industrial operations came through. And she can't open the windows. She is spraying perfume and in her house to mask the stench. She's sweeping up dead flowers. There's feces running down the road. And to me, that shifted my perception of this story. I understood the climate impact of factory farming. It's one of the top contributors to climate change. But seeing that in person and seeing how these rural communities have been decimated really changed things for me and made this story quite a bit different than what I was expecting.
And this is all over the country. I grew up in rural Western Pennsylvania, and that's what happened to these kind of once family farms.
Being pushed out by the industry themselves.
Absolutely.
This is now how 99% of meat and dairy products in the U.S. arrive in the grocery store.
Yeah.
And so when you see these labels about, pasture raised and all these different terms that are being pushed out there, right? Consumers need to know that this is a lot of greenwashing and misinformation.
Tons.
99% of the industry has moved to this model, and it's frankly screwing over not just the animals, the workers, but the farm communities, small farmers as well.
Absolutely it is. And, they have such a huge PR, right? Juggernaut that does good greenwashes exactly. And they use those terms in ways that seem to the public to mean one thing, but legally in reality, they mean something very different.
And that's what Little Red Barns is really about. It's breaking through those stories And as you know, Mickey, like storytelling, we're storytelling animals, and that's how we make sense of the world. And so this mythology of the Little Red Barn, I would encourage listeners, go to the grocery store, see how many of these you can count.
Yeah.
Just walking down the aisles, the coupon books, the signage, it's all telling you a story to really mislead and propagandize and to keep you in the dark about what's really happening in farming.
The corporate grocery store is full of fake news, Will Potter.
That's exactly it.
So, Will Potter, we have a minute or two left. You can go to willpotter.com to learn more. On the backdrop of whatever we want to call that's happening now in the U.S. and around the world, Little Red Barns, of course, is about factory farming. It's about civil rights. It's about the environment. It's about storytelling. Where else might you place it in the backdrop of what's happening right now with creeping reactionary type fascistic tendencies in our institutions and capitulation?
I really hope, in terms of that legacy we're talking about, this book is seen as trying to identify this new fascist and authoritarian playbook and the way that all these issues are intersecting. And to give just one example of that, the FBI for many years was warned by the Justice Department, by the Inspector General, that if it kept focusing on things, farm investigators and undercover journalists, that it was ignoring the rise of right-wing and white supremacist violence. And the FBI just didn't care. And so there's a direct connection here of these priorities of protecting industrial agriculture have allowed a rapid rise of the far right. Right now we're seeing neo-Nazi groups march through the streets of America, sig heils at, conservative conferences, government events. I mean, it's unbelievable, but I see this as really the precursors to all of that. And as we're seeing all this trad wife rhetoric, carnivore diet, hypermasculinity, alpha male nonsense, it's all wrapped in that same story of the Little Red Barn, what it means to be an American, what it means, what this mythological idea of the past is.
The new book by Will Potter, Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable, out now from City Lights Publishers. In addition to going to willpotter.com, Will, anything else you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners about how they might follow your work or get in touch or any of those things?
Yeah, I would encourage folks that part of this project, it causes a lot of changes in my perspective. And Mickey and I were talking earlier, I'm starting a new project. And if people want to stay up to speed on that, at willpotter.com, you can sign up for email updates and be the first to know as I write to launch that in the coming months.
Thanks so much for all of your time, Will Potter, and thanks for your sharing your amazing gifts of storytelling and investigative journalism with us and with the world. Little Red Barns, out from City Lights. Will Potter will definitely be crossing paths again, and we'll have you back on the program.
Thank you, Project Censored. I appreciate all your work.
Right.